This is a really interesting development, given that we have seen also China's announcement of exemptions for tariffs on U.S. products did not include agricultural goods, which President Trump would have liked.
Yeah, that's right. Now, we've had a number of steps, as you say, from both sides to try to at least move things forward in terms of what the expectations are around the talks that we know are going to happen at some point in October. Frankly, it would have been surprising if the Chinese delegation had agreed to go over to Washington to continue these talks if October the 1st, if those tariffs had kicked in. So it's not a major surprise that these have been pushed back. And now, potentially, the window for these meetings, because we don't yet have a fixed date, is going to be before October the 15th, when, of course, Trump says that those additional tariffs will be put in place. So we're talking about the tariffs on $250 billion worth of Chinese goods to the US market that are currently hit at 25%. And the plan from the Trump administration was to raise those to 30%, so an increase of 5%. And as we've been saying, those now look like they're going to hit October the 15th, depending, of course, on how these negotiations go. On the Chinese side, you're right to point out that in the last 24 hours or so, we have had some news out of Beijing around concessions, or how some might frame them as concessions, in terms of exemptions on a tariff list that was put in place in last year. Now, out of the list, there have been 16 product categories that have been exempt from these tariffs, valued at about 1.65 billion US dollars, according to Bloomberg calculations. And they include goods like pharmaceuticals, but also pesticides. But you're right to point out they don't include those big ticket agricultural items like soybeans, US soybeans, beef and pork. And the view is that China is holding on to those as leverage, of course, leading into these negotiations, as we say, at some point in October in Washington.
Well, Tom, in the meantime, you spoke to someone with an inside track on China's trade war tactics. What did he have to say about the way things stand?
Yeah, this is Hu Xijin, who is the editor-in-chief of the influential and rather nationalistic newspaper, The Global Times, here in Beijing. And he is a man who has been pretty prescient in terms of his forecasts, his predictions for how China is playing out its trade war strategy. So we sat down with him yesterday. I started by asking whether or not these moves around the tariff exemptions was a sign that Beijing was trying to placate the US ahead of these trade talks in Washington. Take a listen.
Let's not think of it as a concession. It's a goodwill gesture that shows China is confident. It's different from a concession.
So I also asked Hu Xijin whether or not it was the US or the Chinese strategy to wait out President Trump past the 2020 elections. He says he doesn't think that is part of the planning here in Beijing. I also asked him about Bolton, of course, who is seen as something of a China hawk. He says that the fact that John Bolton is no longer part of the US administration may potentially make it easier to get some kind of deal. He said he was a bit of a negative influence when it came to thinking in the US around how to approach China. And longer term, he thinks that actually there is now a greater chance of some kind of deal between the US and Chinese side. He says he's feeling a little bit more positive in terms of what may come out of these talks in October and what that may eventually lead to.